US plans preemptive action with options under consideration, including an $800 billion fund which would purchase toxic assets such as high-risk subprime mortgage debt. Another $400 billion could go into the FDIC to ensure against collapse of money market funds. Well, these actions would clearly be of huge benefit to the financial institutions struggling to survive, let alone thrive in the current environment. Do they really deserve any favourable treatment? Our next guest says the companies that have gone under so far in the banking crisis are all victims, that is, of their own poor management. He says the chief executives of businesses like Lehman and AIG were affected by internal blindness and a state of denial. He says the disregard for sensible risk management procedures smacks of the most elementary kind of managerial incompetence. Our guest is Professor David Costa, Dean of Robert Kennedy College. He joins us now live from Zurich. Robert, David, good morning. Thanks very much for joining us. You've said a lot of things then, and let's rattle through some of the comments you've made, the leaders of these bankers, and you talk about what you define as internal blindness. Just tell us what that means.
Well, I define internal blindness in this particular regard, where the chief executive of a company, if we look at the last one, probably is Lehman to look at, really disregard the basic principle, which is when there is a problem, you shouldn't underestimate the problem. And that is exactly what they did. They just waited the very last moment, and they were blind. Why blind? Because they failed to see that the entity of the problem wouldn't allow them to be sold out at very high valuation. So perhaps we have seen the shares going down all the way from 20 to 0. And so they had to act much before that. Just imagine if you had a company, how would you go just on a Sunday to have a decision of whether you go bankrupt or whether someone saves you? It's completely unacceptable, especially for people like those chief executives, which they've been paid in the order of hundreds of millions of dollars in the last 3 years in the case of Lehman. Similar situation we had on Bear Stearns, where the CEO was not as present when there were all these issues. They underestimated largely the issue they were affected from. And the same is applicable to AIG, where they parted ways for Greenberg. The new management failed to understand the basic principle of risk management.
Like you said, beggars belief. But let's try and figure it out. I mean, how is it that such an array of qualified managers repeated these mistakes? Management 101 mistakes, you call them.
Exactly. I mean, the explanation is pretty straightforward. The managers are overconfident. They're going through all the problems of different entities before. They've gone through it. So they reach this confidence, overconfidence, which let them say, we've been here for 100 and odd years, we will still be here, and we shouldn't undersell a company to another entity. So they really disconnect from the reality. They don't have an objective view, and very often the way the boards are composed, in the case also of Lehman, it's probably not sufficient. The boards, they exercise more control and step in and say, look, here we have something, especially independent directors, which you have to take care of, and you have to take care of very quickly. It's really management 101. How would you wait the Sunday morning and say, either we find a solution today or we go bankrupt? It's something that if you were doing that in your own company, even if you wait a month before, every bank will say, sorry, we cannot give you any money. Why should it be different for a brokerage company? They failed also to understand that the banking landscape changed. And I think in this actual banking landscape, there is space only for players which don't want to be a universal institution, and they're happy with single-digit growth.
Who's going to ultimately pick up the bill then, David? I mean, is it right that then the follies of a generation of irresponsible financiers is ultimately going to fall on the future generations of taxpayers?
Absolutely.
Oh, looks like we've lost David there. Apologies for that. Just in the middle of a question. We'll try and get back to him in a few seconds' time. No, he is still there. Are you still there, David? Oh, he can hear me? Yeah, he can hear me. Apologies to our viewers. Yeah, I can hear you. I'll ask you that question again, David. We just lost you for a second. Apologies for that. Who picks up the bill, David, because of these irresponsible financiers, as you put it? I mean, is it the future generations of taxpayers?
Yeah, they are the taxpayers in the long run. In the short run are all those loyal employees which trusted their leadership, trusted their management. And that's a pretty sad picture, because if you have such a big organization with so many people involved, there are inevitably also very talented people working there. And they are paying the bill in the short term, and the shareholders, of course. In the long term, ultimately will be the taxpayers picking up the bill for all those big banks, because now the US has no other choice than bailing out those institutions. AIG, as I wrote in my notes, had absolutely no choice. AIG could not fail, so US had to step in.
So let's look to the big news of today, David, this Federal Reserve Treasury plan to cleanse this toxic debt from the balance sheets and move it on to maybe some type of agency, onto the Federal Reserve's balance sheet or whatever. Does that draw some sort of line in the sand?
I think it's very helpful. I think it's the right step. However, I would really look at the source of the problem, which is housing. My worry is there are so many unsold properties in the United States that, yes, you can move this toxic asset, you can create it in a different agency, but at the end of the day, if you don't solve the immediate problem of housing, if you don't really go to the root and find a solution for the people which are losing their house, or for all those empty houses, we have to look a bit more long term. I mean, in the short term, obviously this solution is appropriate, and you will see probably the stock exchange already today reacting on that.
Okay.
But on the long term, they need really to look into what causes the problem.
David, thanks so much for joining us today. David Costa there from Robert Kennedy.